The industrialization of eating. What we do know. You know, I've dwelled on the all but forgotten ideas of people like Weston Price and Sir Albert Howard, the ecological thinkers about the human food chain, because they point us down a path that might lead the way out of this narrow and ultimately helpful, unhelpful confines of nutritionism, right? Of thinking about the food strictly in terms of its chemical constituents, right? See, what we need to know is, well, it seems to me, it's to create a broader, more kind of an ecological, more cultural view of our food. So what would happen if we were to start thinking about food, for example, as less of a thing and more of a relationship, So in nature, that is, of course, precisely what eating has always been. Relationships among species and systems that we call food chains or food webs that reach all the way down to the soil. Species co-evolve with the other species that they eat. And very often there develops a relationship of interdependence, right? I'll feed you if you spread around my genes. So in ecology, we learned that a gradual process of mutual adaptation transforms something like an apple or a squash into a nutritious and tasty food for an animal. And over time, and through trial and error, the plant becomes tastier and often more conspicuous in order to gratify the animal need and the desire. So while the animal gradually acquires whatever digestive tools, the enzymes, for example, that it needs to make for optimal use of that plant. So similarly, the milk of cows, well, they didn't start out as a nutritious food for humans. In fact, it made them sick until people who lived around, cows evolved the ability to digest the milk as adults. So the gene for the production of a milk digesting enzyme is called lactase, and it used to switch off. In humans shortly after weaning until about 5,000 years ago. But when a mutation that kept the gene switched on started to appear, and it quickly spread through a population of animal herders in North Central Europe. At least that's what they believe. Why? Because the people, right, possessing this new mutation then had access to a terrifically nutritious new food source. And as a consequence, where they're able to produce more offspring than the people who lacked it. And so this development proved much to the advantage of, both the milk drinkers and the cows, whose numbers and habitat and health greatly improved as a result of this new symbiotic relationship. So health is, among other things, right, the product of being in these sorts of relationships. In a food chain is a great many such relationships in the case of an omnivorous creature like man. So it follows that when the health of one part of the food chain is disturbed, it can affect all the other creatures in it. So if the soil is sick or toxic with Roundup, pesticides and herbicides, or it's going to cause deficiency to that soil. So the grasses that grow in that soil are going to, and the cattle that eat the grasses, and the people who drink the milk and eat the cattle from them get sick. This is precisely what Weston Price and Sir Howard had in mind when they sought to connect the seemingly distant realms of soil and human health. So our personal health cannot be divorced from the health of the entire food web. That's what you need to understand. And in many cases, long familiarity between the foods and their eaters leads to this elaborate systems of communication up and down the food chain, so that a creature's senses comes to recognize foods as suitable by their taste and smell and color. And very often these signals are sent by the foods themselves, which, they may have their own reasons for wanting to be eaten. So ripeness, for example, in fruit is often signaled by a distinctive smell, an appealing scent that can travel over distances even, or color, one that stands out from the general green, or taste, typically sweet. Ripeness, which is the moment when the seeds of the plant are ready to go off and germinate, typically coincides with the greatest concentration of nutrients in a fruit. So the interests of the plant for transportation align with those of the plant eater for nutriment. So our bodies, having received these signals and determined this food is good to eat, now produces in anticipation precisely the enzymes and the acids needed to break it down. So health depends heavily on knowing how to read these biological signals. This looks ripe. This smells spoiled. That's one slick looking cow. This is much easier to do when you have long experience of a food, and much harder when a food has been, expressly designed to deceive your senses with, say, artificial flavors or synthetic sweeteners and man-made stuff. So foods that lie to our senses are one of the most challenging features of the Western diet. And note that these ecological relationships are, at least in the first instance, between eaters and whole foods, not nutrients or chemicals, even though the food is in question eventually get broken down into our bodies into simple chemical compounds, right? As corn is reduced mostly to simple sugars. The qualities of the whole foods are not unimportant. The amount and the structure of the fiber in that corn, for example, is going to determine such things as the speed at which the sugars in it will be released and absorbed. Something that we've learned is critical to insulin metabolism. So the chemist will tell you that the starch in corn is on its way to becoming glucose in the blood. But what reductive understanding, overlooks the complex and variable processes by which that happens? So contrary to the nutrition label, not all carbohydrates are created equal. So put another way, our bodies have a long-standing and suitable relationship to corn that they do not have to high fructose corn syrup, right? And such a relationship with corn syrup might develop someday as people evolve superhuman insulin systems to cope with regular floods of, pure fructose and glucose. Because glucose is a sugar molecule that is the body's main source of energy, right? Most carbohydrates are broken down to glucose during digestion. Fructose is a different form of sugar and commonly found in fruit. So sucrose, or table sugar, is a disaccharide consisting of a molecule of glucose joined to a molecule of fructose. But for now, just know that the relationship leads to ill health because our bodies don't know how to handle these biological novelties. And of course, this can be said for fructose as well as anything synthetic and artificial, including drugs, certain medications, and even synthetic nutritional supplements. Again, the difference between whole food supplements and synthetic supplements, like the ones prescribed by your doctor, is a lengthy, heated discussion with a ton of unknowns surrounding that debate. Again, as Michael Pollan says, nutritional science, unfortunately, is still stuck in the year 1650, where surgery was just beginning. He says it's promising, but I think I'll wait. And I always add that you can't understand the science of humanity through the anamorphic lens of a rat or an ear mole. It's like a kaleidoscope, right? It looks pretty to look at, it's beautiful, it's interesting, and that's it. Because it doesn't offer much for humanity. This is a truth bomb in science camps right now that no one argues, but because they don't know the solution for this, they just sweep it under the rug. In much the same way, human bodies that can cope with chewing cocoa leaves, right? A long-standing relationship between native people and the cocoa plant, say in parts of South America. They can't cope with cocaine or crack, even though the same active ingredients are present in all three. So this reductionism as a way of understanding food or drugs that may be harmless, even necessary, but reductionism in practice, reducing food or drug plants to their most salient chemical compounds, can lead to serious problems. Looking at eating food through this ecological lens opens a whole new perspective on exactly what the Western diet is. A radical and, at least in evolutionary terms, abrupt set of changes over the course of the last 150 years. Not just to our foodstuffs, but also to our food relationships, all the way from the soil to the meal. The rise of the ideology of nutritionists is in itself part of that change. So when we think of a species environment, we usually think in terms of things like geography, predators and prey, and the weather, -20 degrees right now. But of course, one of the most critical components of any creature's environment is the nature of the food available to it and its relationship to the species it eats. Much is at stake when a creature's food environment changes. For us, the first big change came, they say, 10,000 years ago, when the advent of agriculture, and it devastated our health. It led to just a monopoly of deficiencies and infectious diseases that we've only managed to get under control in the last century or so. And the biggest change in our food environment since then the advent of the modern Western diet. So this is video number 1 of a short series. I'm going to go and talk to you about the industrialization of food. I've covered the bullet points already on our podcast, Dynamism Biohack. You can find it on the web, iHeartRadio, even Spotify. Just search my name. But through video like this, I want to go a bit more deep than I do on the podcast. So next video, I'm going to talk about what I mean by, from whole foods to refined foods and what that did to our health. See, because to get a better grip on the nature of these changes is to begin to understand how we might alter our relationship to food for the better and for our health. These changes have been numerous and far-reaching, but consider as a start these 5 fundamental transformations to our foods that I want to cover in this series and its ways of eating. All of them can be reversed, if not perhaps so easily in the food system as a whole, certainly in the life and diet of any individual eater, and without, I hasten to add, returning to the bush or taking up hunting and gathering. See, we want to live like an ancient, but in modern civilization. And I'm going to show you how to do just that in this series of the 8 driver of a dynamic health. A metaphor I use, that is our lifestyle and our environment, right? How well we eat, move, think, connect, and cope with the stressors in daily life determine your health destiny. It's not the pill for an ill, it's not the blame it, name it for a drug approach. You get sick, or you are sick, usually because of how you were living prior to getting sick. It's a toxicity and or a deficiency that we need to address. And that deficiency are these 5 things: how well you eat, move, think, connect, and cope with stressors. And this series is going to be about the 8 driver of a dynamic health. Till next time, lighten up, move better, and live fuller.